Alright, so before I start this video, I do need to credit a couple of people. Number one, Xylo1 for the custom art used in the thumbnail, Crown Fiend and Golden Motifs as well, for the fact that they kind of helped me like sort out the beginning of this idea. Because originally I was trying to give him the shield and all that, but it just wasn't really working. Next thing you know, it just sounded way too similar to canon. So I'd like to thank them for that, for getting me out to that mental state. Also, thank you again to Xylo for the idea as well. Although I did end up changing it quite a bit from the original intention, I guess. But yeah, enough of me rambling. Let's just get on to the video. Naofumi Iwatani, over the years he would find himself being deeply infatuated with the different belief systems of his world, the different religions you could say. Naofumi, he was so infatuated in fact that he would even study religion in college. This would have been his main major. This would have been his major in college, to study religion. This being so that he could become a minister later on in his life. While studying for one of his exams late at night one day, Naofumi would actually come across a rather peculiar book. This book being titled something along the lines of the Four Holy Heroes. Naofumi, he had read a lot of books regarding religions lately, and this was the first time he had come across a book like this. He had heard of many religions over the years, but this was the first time he heard about one regarding four heroes. He would be intrigued and take a look at this book, figuring that this might be on his next exam. While reading through it, he would find something that was weird. This being that some of the pages, they were missing. They were blank for some reason, and it just so happened to be around the shield hero's part. He wondered why. Was this like a misprint? Naofumi would be scratching his head, and he would flip through more pages, wondering if it was just those couple of pages, but no. The more he continued to flip through the pages, the more he would see that all of them were blank. Next thing you know, Naofumi would just be at a loss for words. He would be wondering if this was a mistake, if this was a joke, or he didn't even know what to call it at this point. Why was the shield hero's part blank? Did they really forget to print out all those pages, or was it meant to be blank, that the people were meant to fill out these pages? Naofumi he was honestly very confused, but he would be even more confused when he noticed a bright green light beginning to emit from these blank pages. Naofumi, he would be forced to shield his eyes as the light enveloped him. Naofumi, he would open up his eyes so afterwards, after he felt as if the light had begun to dull down, and he would see that he was in a completely new environment. It looked like he was in a castle of the sorts. He noticed that there were 3 other guys close to his age who would be standing there looking around in confusion as well. Naofumi would also notice that they had weapons in their arms. Well, in their hands, I should say. The same weapons that he read from the book earlier. A spear, a bow, and a sword. Naofumi would look down to see what his weapon was, but his hands were completely free. His back, though, it felt a bit heavier than usual. It was as if he was carrying a book bag in high school again, or middle school. The other boys in the room, they would look over to Naofumi. They had confused looks on their faces. They would bring up the fact that Naofumi had wings, and they would question why that was the case. Naofumi would raise an eyebrow as well, wondering what they meant by wings before deciding to look over his shoulder. Sure enough, they weren't lying. Naofumi genuinely had wings. Bright, white, feathery wings, like that of an angel usually depicted in murals, maybe like the Renaissance era or something. Before Naofumi could even try to figure out a reason for this being the case, the quartet, they would be led to the king. The king would look at Naofumi strangely, wondering which hero Naofumi was. He recognized the sword, bow, and spear hero, but Naofumi, he was a completely different story. The shield hero should have been summoned in Naofumi's place, but Naofumi would reveal that he was equally confused. He didn't even understand why he was summoned here in the first place. Sure, he heard the priest talking about, great heroes, something along those lines, all that mumbo jumbo at first, but he didn't believe that was actually true. The king, he wouldn't be all that concerned though. He would re-explain everything to the heroes. In all honesty, this could be a good thing that the shield hero wasn't summoned after all. He honestly despised the devil of the shield. He wouldn't reveal this part to the heroes though. He would just explain the purpose for why the heroes were summoned here, and this being so that they could protect their world from the waves of calamity. Naofumi would immediately show his willingness to help, but it would be drowned out by the other heroes who wanted to be given a reason for why they should help in this situation, rather than just actually storm the king's castle, just take over or something along those lines. The king would explain that the heroes, they would be given pretty much anything, any great reward that they desired after defeating the waves. While the waves were happening though, the heroes, they would be given parties and wages. They needed to level up as much as possible in this world if they were to ever be effective at taking down the monsters from the waves. The other heroes, they would be satisfied with the king's answer, and they would go about their business afterwards. They would go up to their rooms and they would begin to start talking to each other. Turns out that they all came from different worlds, and they would all be surprised when finding out that Naofumi was actually studying to become a minister. This was very intriguing to some of them. They figured that he was probably going to be a more holy person than them if that were the case. The next day, the heroes would actually have their parties be selected. Well, more so, the people would be choosing which heroes they would be partying with or joining teams with. Naofumi, unfortunately, he would receive nobody. Naofumi would be confused, but Motoyasu would explain that it was probably because he was seemingly a new hero and no one knew what he was capable of. After all, he had wings. What could a person with wings do in a fight? Maybe fly out to the way or something? Honestly, Motoyasu would consider Naofumi's quote-unquote weapon to be a bit of a joke. Naofumi, he would feel a bit down but not discouraged. He figured that this was probably a test given from God to persevere when the odds were against him. One girl from the Spirit Heroes team would actually raise her hand though, requesting to switch over to Naofumi's team. The king would allow this, and Naofumi, he would mention that it really wasn't all that necessary that she join his team. After all, he didn't want her joining his team out of pity. Mine would fake a smile though, explaining that it was unnecessary for him to feel as if she was doing this out of pity. She was interested in what this angelic hero, or so she called it, was capable of. Naofumi would find that the name Angelic Hero had a pretty nice ring to it. He liked it. The teams would go out to collect experience points, although originally they were planning on working together in order to collect experience points, maybe just be in a whole group together, but the king and his guardians would end up informing them that that wasn't going to be the case at all. The reason being because, well, there was a bit of a system to the legendary weapons in where they wouldn't be able to gain nearly as much progress as they would if they were to separate. If the heroes were to just stay together as a group, then they would make little to no progress whatsoever in terms of leveling up, so they would have to unfortunately split up. They didn't want to test the theory out that maybe their king was just lying. They honestly had no reason to not believe the king. After all, he was born into this world. They were just brought to it, literally just a day ago. So the teams, they would listen to the king, and when it came on to Mine and Naofumi, Mine would actually lead Naofumi over to an area where there were several orange balloon monsters. Right after they went to Airhead's weapon shop, they would introduce themselves, and Naofumi, he would actually buy Mine a couple of equipment, you could say. Basically, he would just buy her some armor, and although it was expensive, Mine would say that it was completely necessary. Naofumi, after, he would be confused as to how he would be capable of fighting monsters. Well, that was at first, until he looked through his skills. Within a limited amount of skills he had, level 1, he would find something that seemed to be kinda interesting. Seemingly useful. It was something called feather projection, whatever that meant. He would decide to try this skill out, and he would find that he could shoot out his feathers like they were projectiles. Now this was interesting. Each feather was like a blade, popping the balloon monsters rather easily. One balloon monster, they would get past his attacks though. He wasn't all that great with his precision as of yet. He wasn't all that accurate with his blades just yet, since he was still at level 1 in this world. They would try to bite Naofumi, but Naofumi would stretch out his arm in hopes of avoiding the monster biting off his face. An aura of light would emit from the arm though, which would incinerate the balloon monster instantly. Naofumi would find this to be extremely interesting. Mine, she would be skeptical of Naofumi though. She found that his abilities, although not that of the shield hero, could prove to be a threat later on to her religion. He also spoke of studying religions back in his own world, and Mine found out that Naofumi was planning on becoming a minister later on in his life. Hearing this, she felt as if this was going against the sacredness of her own religion though. The religion regarding the 3 heroes, the sword, bow, and spear. Naofumi's whole existence basically conflicted with what she believed for oh so long. She figured that there was an association with the angelic hero and the devil of the shield. She didn't truly believe he was an angel, but rather he was more so a wolf in sheep's clothing. At best, he was probably a fallen angel trying to act as if he was one, and trying to act as if he was a real angel. There was no way that an actual angel could be brought into this world. She would make it her mission to slander this man's name, drag it across the mud, let everybody understand that he was far from a saint. Naofumi would be unaware of this though. The two, they would decide to stay at an inn for the night, and they would sleep in separate rooms. Mine would offer Naofumi a drink or two, but he would explain that it went against his beliefs to be drinking right now. Naofumi would just head up to bed right after he finished eating, and the next day Naofumi would find that he had been robbed. He would be quite alarmed finding this out. His eyes would have widened and he would look around. He would be panicking. He would even go outside hoping to find out whether or not he could pursue the people who robbed him. Guards would surround Naofumi though, and Naofumi, he would try to explain the situation, but the guards, they weren't hearing any of it. Rather, they would drag him over to the castle, and where he would be forced to face the king. He would accuse Naofumi of defiling mine. Naofumi would deny this though, explaining that he went to bed right after supper. He didn't even believe in touching a woman in certain places before marriage. The king would try to mention how he was drunk during that night, and that's why he ended up trying to pursue mine in such a vile way. But Naofumi would mention that he never drank. It also goes against his beliefs to be drinking at such a time. Drinking was to only happen on certain occasions. This was not one of the occasions. Ren and Itsuki, they would hear Naofumi out and actually stand up for him. The king would be appalled seeing this, and he would try to get the boys onto his side. The boys would question whether or not the king had any proof of Naofumi doing anything to mine. From what they saw, she didn't show any signs of having even been grabbed. The king would be a sputtering mess at this point. Sure, he would try to pull out the whole fact that there were undergarments in Naofumi's room, but Naofumi would mention that he didn't understand where they could have came from. He made sure to keep his door locked as well. Or maybe it wasn't locked properly. For all they knew, somebody could have planted that as some form of evidence against him. Ren and Itsuki, they would bring up the fact that, well, Naofumi was making pretty valid points going against the king's argument. The king would just be even more at a loss for words now. He was trying to come up with just about anything in order to put Naofumi in a negative light, but it wasn't working. Even the guards, they were beginning to believe Naofumi more. They were beginning to doubt the king's words right now and figure that foul play was used here. Naofumi would be exuding a form of purity at this point. Motoyasu, he would try to defend mine though, and shame the other heroes for defending a criminal like Naofumi. When looking at Naofumi though, even Motoyasu, he would find himself questioning his resolve. He would look the other way so that he wouldn't have to deal with this and deal with questioning his own resolve. Every time he seemed to look at Naofumi, it was as if he was beginning to question whether or not he believed his own words. The king would order for Naofumi to leave his castle. His name had already been associated with the supposed crime he committed. Everyone would condemn him as a guilty man within a kingdom, at the very least. Naofumi, he would depart from the castle, mostly disappointed in that many people did not believe his story, but he would be somewhat happy that he was at least able to get Ren and Itsuki on his side. Most people, they would refuse to do business with Naofumi afterwards, albeit hesitantly, due to the aura that he was exuding. It just felt as if he really did no wrong, but they had to go with what the story told. They didn't want to ruin their own businesses by associating themselves with this angelic hero. It wasn't all that strong yet. Well, this passive skill of Naofumi's. I heard the weapon shop owner, he would want to actually beat up Naofumi for supposedly assaulting mine, but when he actually did come up face to face with Naofumi, he would pause midway while grabbing him. He was about to clobber him, but he would look in Naofumi's eyes. The look in Naofumi's eyes would let him know that the boy, he was genuinely innocent. He would let Naofumi go and explain his story. Naofumi would explain his innocence, and he would be glad that the shop owner was actually willing to listen to him, unlike most people. Everyone besides the bow and sword hero believed him to genuinely be a criminal with little to no evidence at all. Or heard, he would feel pretty bad for the kid, and he would give Naofumi some clothes to help him survive out there in the wild. He knew that it was going to be pretty harsh for him moving forward, but at the very least these clothes may help him. He would level up with his wings and discovering new abilities, but find that it would probably be faster if he had a party member or two. Naofumi, he would use his wings as projectiles and have an aura that could brain weaker enemies. But he would be lying if he said he didn't get overwhelmed sometimes by his enemies, especially if it was like a large group, ones coming from the front and the back. He could only notice the ones in the front and the ones in the back. They were another story. Sure, he could maybe fly up in the air, but at the same time, he noticed that his projectiles, they were a lot less accurate when he was in the air, and it was a bit of a struggle to maintain flying and attacking at the same time, using aerial attacks, which were his feather blades. Naofumi, he would be collecting some points and all, but he would have figured that it would probably be a lot faster if he had a party member or two. A strange man would actually introduce himself to Naofumi one night, and he would offer the male a prospect of purchasing a slave. A slave? Naofumi would raise his eyebrow. The strange man would convince Naofumi though. The slave could perhaps help him in his battles so he wouldn't get overwhelmed by the stronger ones to come. After all, a legendary hero like Naofumi could only get so far by himself. A legendary hero like Naofumi needed a party, people to cover the things that he was missing. Naofumi, he would be against the prospect of buying a slave, but at the same time, he had to think about his choices, he had to weigh them in, and he realized that he didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. He would decide to follow the man to his shop, and he would look through all of the slaves. At first, he would see the ones that he genuinely could not afford, until he would continue looking around and find a sick demi-human. She looked to be pretty small, and she was sick as well. He would decide to buy her out of pity. He wanted to help her as much as possible. She was a small raccoon girl. Right when they were about to have a slave mic added in Raphtalia, Naofumi would stop the slave trader. He would explain that this was unnecessary. He didn't want this girl to be his slave. He just wanted her to be his partner in battle. He didn't want her to do anything against her own will. The man would comply with Naofumi's requests, and the girl's the girl's eyes, they would begin to light up. Hearing Naofumi explain his desire for the girl, the fact that he didn't want her as a slave, was it really too good to be true? She would have to figure that out later. For right now, she would have to understand what this guy was all about. The man would comply with Naofumi's requests, and Naofumi would bring the little girl to the weapon shop owner, where he would buy her a knife. That was pretty much all he could afford for her right now. The two would go on to hunt some monsters afterward, and the girl would even reveal her name to Naofumi. It would be Raphtalia. She was beginning to show her worth right now when attacking some of the orange balloon monsters. While in Naofumi's presence, Raphtalia, she would begin to notice that there were healing properties to his aura. Within only a couple of days, she would no longer feel sick. Her mental health, it was actually beginning to get better as well. Raphtalia would be afraid of killing one of the monsters one day though. This being because of the fact the rabbit monster, well, they would bleed when she would kill them. Naofumi would preach about how she would be fighting against the evil that polluted her world, or something along those lines. He would kill the monster himself, but she needed this as a form of growth. It would be a learning experience for Raphtalia. Think of it as a test of courage. If she could not kill the rabbit monster, well, Naofumi would inform her that he would just have to remove her from his party and find somebody else, someone that would replace her. Raphtalia's eyes, they would widen hearing this. She didn't want to be replaced. She didn't want to lose Naofumi. Sure, he wasn't a shielder or anything, but he was the nicest person she had met in a long time, ever since the loss of her parents. She would take Naofumi over anybody, any day. She had abandonment issues, and she didn't want to depart from Naofumi. She would go in and stab the rabbit, killing it. She would freak out seeing the blood by Naofumi. He would hug and comfort her. He would rub her head and say that it would all be okay. He was here for her. Raphtalia, she would begin to calm down while being embraced by Naofumi. After that event, Naofumi would deem it time to upgrade Raphtalia's weapon, going to the weapon shop owner to give her a pair of daggers now. While journeying and leveling up, Naofumi and Raphtalia, they would find themselves entering a cave. They were hoping to collect some ores that were apparently very valuable to the surrounding villagers. But while in the cave, Raphtalia, she would encounter a two-headed black dog. This would trigger a PTSD at this moment. She would remember what happened to her parents in the last wave, remembering what sort of creature killed her parents. It resembled this exact monster. Naofumi would rest his hand on her head though, when seeing her beginning to freak out, seeing her beginning to shiver. This would give her a sense of relief though. She would calm down from this calming aura that Naofumi was exuding at this moment. She felt as if she was being imbued with confidence at this moment. Raphtalia would go in and attack the creature, plunging her daggers into the monster's eyes. She would stab the monster in the throat afterwards, and she would just let it bleed out from there on. Raphtalia's level would also increase her rate of maturity, both physically and mentally. Naofumi, he wouldn't notice it at first though, but he would eventually notice it in the form of Raphtalia beginning to demand that Naofumi take better care of himself. She would actually request that he buy himself some better equipment. Naofumi, he would try to mention that he had a holy aura that already did enough to protect himself from most creatures. Raphtalia would point out that, yeah, the whole thing about that aura, yeah, nah, it only worked against the weaker monsters. If the monster was strong enough, they would be able to bypass this aura, and they would actually be able to physically hurt him. Naofumi would be surprised, and he would listen to Raphtalia's demand, seeing that her reasoning was pretty valid. They would head to the Dragon Hourglass afterwards to see when the next wave was. The four heroes, they would actually meet up at this exact location with each other there. Well, with everybody and their party members there, Motoyasu, he would look over to Raphtalia. He would actually warn her about Naofumi, talking about what he ended up doing to mine back in the day, and back just during their second day in this world. Raphtalia, she would pay no mind to Motoyasu though. She would have honestly taken what Motoyasu was saying with a grain of salt, not really believing a word that he said. All of the heroes and their companions, they would be teleported over to where the wave was happening afterwards, right when the dragon hourglass, and I said that time was up, right when the dragon hourglass basically showed the timer hitting 0. All of the heroes and their companions, they would begin to look around, exploring the place, while the other 3 heroes, they would immediately head off to find the main boss. Naofumi, he would decide to pick up Raphtalia and fly, exploring the region more. He figured that more people were being affected, and that it would be best to help those villagers out. He would shoot down feather blades at several monsters, killing them in the process. He would have gained better proficiency when it came on to his feather projectiles at this point, and he would even notice that, well, he could even use them while flying and they were still rather accurate. Sure, some would just hit the ground or just hit random objects instead of monsters, but it was still a whole lot more precise than when he first started. He would soar down at one point, settling down in one of the villages that were being attacked by monsters. Melormug soldiers, they were casting destructive spells and different towards the state of Ryut village. Now for me, he would try to stop the soldiers though, mentioning how they were doing more damage than good, but most cared very little for Naofumi's opinion on the matter. Some would listen to Naofumi though, going against the original orders given by their captain. Naofumi and Raphtalia, they would decide to deal with the rest of the monsters in the village, and Naofumi, he would end up testing out a new skill here. It was called Solar Radiance. It involved him flying up into mid-air and shooting beams of light down on his opponents. This would actually kill off the remaining monsters. Naofumi would descend, healing the villagers that were harmed in the attack. He would use his aura to heal them, with many mentioning how it felt like a comfortable warmth, sort of like a warm blanket. Once Motoyasu ran and Itsuki managed to kill the Chimera boss, the second wave would have ended. A party would be held for the heroes afterward. Naofumi and Raphtalia, they would attend, actually having a good time for once. More so Raphtalia than Naofumi though. Naofumi, he was just glad to see that Raphtalia was happy, genuinely enjoying herself, not having to worry about fighting any monsters, even if it was just for the night. Mine, she would notice Raphtalia though, and she would decide to meddle with Naofumi's party by deciding to deceive Motoyasu in a way by having him believe that Raphtalia was a slave, and that there was a slave crest on her, forcing her to work with Naofumi. Motoyasu, he would be disgusted and approach Naofumi, throwing his glove down to the floor. He would demand that Naofumi have a duel against him. He would claim that it was unfit for a hero to have a slave in their party, but Naofumi, he would be confused. He didn't know what Motoyasu was talking about. He would mention that Raphtalia wasn't a slave. Rather, he actually rescued her from a slave trader. He bought her out to slavery. He even made sure to remove her slave mark from the very beginning. Well, not even really remove. More so, he made sure to not even have it be put on her in the first place. Raphtalia was here willingly, and that was just it. Nothing more, nothing less. Motoyasu would begin to doubt himself hearing these words, before shaking his head and even hitting himself in the temples a couple of times, telling himself to focus. He refused to believe that mind would lie to him. He would tell Naofumi to get out of his head as well. He knew that this guy probably had some mind tricks up his sleeve. That was probably why he was able to convince Ren and Itsuki. But Naofumi, he would be confused once more. Just what was Motoyasu getting on about? Now he was accusing him of mind control? Come on. Naofumi would even tell Motoyasu to get over himself, but guards, they would actually grab Raphtalia. King Oldcray, he would declare that Naofumi actually had to fight Motoyasu. If a duel was declared, then a duel would have to be done between the two heroes. It was apparently part of the system. Naofumi found this to be a pretty stupid law in this world, but if it meant that he could get Raphtalia back, then sure, he would decide to take up Motoyasu's, request for a duel apparently, since he was more so being forced to do this more than anything. Naofumi, he would question what was in for him if he won. Motoyasu would tisk before offering him his wages for the next month if he won, although he doubted that Naofumi could possibly win against him. After all, he only had wings. What were a pair of wings going to do against a spear? Naofumi found this situation to be a headache, but he had no choice apparently. The two would go over to the courtyard where an audience would be watching their duel. Naofumi would immediately overwhelm Motoyasu from the very beginning by soaring in his direction, slamming the spear hero into a wall. Motoyasu would actually gasp in pain. Naofumi would whisper an apology to Motoyasu, although he would barely be able to hear this considering the fact that his ears were ringing right now. He was just trying to tell Motoyasu that he was doing everything necessary to save Raphtalia. He didn't trust Raphtalia in the hands of the king after all. Motoyasu would push Naofumi off of him though, and he would stumble back onto his feet. He would aim his spear at Naofumi and charge, although at first when standing he was a bit wobbly. Even while charging, he was kind of losing his balance. He was stumbling. He would lose his footing for a bit, but he would get back onto his feet, charging once more. Naofumi, he would shoot a beam of light at Motoyasu though, throwing him off of his feet once more. He would slam into the wall once more, but he would try to get up, letting his pride take over at this moment. He would refuse to believe that someone whose weapon was just a pair of wings could possibly defeat him in a battle, especially so easily. Naofumi would shoot his feathers at Motoyasu though, aiming them at his face. He would make sure that Motoyasu got the memo that he had lost, and that he needed to surrender right now, if he didn't want himself to look like SpongeBob afterwards. Mine would attempt to shoot out a gust of wind in order to throw him off, in order to throw Naofumi off and give Motoyasu an advantage in this battle, but Naofumi, he would fly out of the way, already feeling the disturbance from his wings. Motoyasu would question what feathers could possibly do to him, only for one to actually pierce through his knee, causing him to scream in pain. The king, he would be forced to give the win to Naofumi here. Raphtalia, she would be released from the guard's grasp and she would run over to Naofumi's side. Running into Ki, they would receive a significant amount of gold for their efforts in the wave afterwards. That was the reward. While Naofumi, he would receive only a couple hundred silver. Naofumi would question why he got so light an amount, with the king pointing out how they needed to use the rest of Naofumi's rewards for his win against Motoyasu to heal him. Naofumi would point out how that was unnecessary though. The king would have a quizzical look on his face, until Naofumi actually walked over to Motoyasu's battered body, where he would rest his hand on the blonde shoulder. His aura would actually extend to Motoyasu as well. It looked like a golden flame was enveloping Motoyasu when he was getting healed. All of his wounds, they would begin to close up. Everyone would be amazed seeing this, but Motoyasu, he would shove Naofumi's hand off of him once he was completely healed. The other heroes would look over to the king, who would be forced to give Naofumi his full amount since he could no longer use the excuse of Motoyasu's injuries. Naofumi, he would use the money to buy another slave or two off with a slave trader, giving them their freedom, or well, that was a plan anyways. He would actually decide to settle with 2 months to exile. Naofumi would actually head out to Ryut village and notice something odd about these eggs. They were already beginning to hatch. When the 2 eggs fully hatched, Naofumi would find that he had a Filolio and a griffin as part of his team. This was pretty interesting. Naofumi would be happy to see this, and he would greet his new party members. Naofumi, he would name the Filolio Vilo, while Raphtalia, she would be a bit more creative when it came onto naming the griffin. She would name the griffin Tiberius. The two would grow rapidly throughout the day of them leveling up. By the time Motoyasu and Mine made their way into the village, Vilo and Tiberius could already be ridden on. They were practically fully grown at this point. Mine would declare Motoyasu as the new lord of Ryut village, and that they would be adding taxes to this region. The taxes that were being listed out just seemed pretty outrageous though. Naofumi would be forced to step in at this moment and explain the condition of the village, explaining that they were too poor to afford these taxes that Mine and Motoyasu were trying to force onto them. Mine would refuse to listen to Naofumi though, and mysterious individuals covered in black, they would appear before Mine with a paper in hand. Reading it, Mine would grow more and more angry. When she had finished, she would look over to Naofumi and declare that if he wanted to be the new lord of this, town, this village, so that they wouldn't have to pay Motoyasu's taxes, then, they would settle it with a race of sorts. Naofumi, he would end up deciding to use Vilo to race against Motoyasu. They would actually end up winning in the end, despite the soldiers on Motoyasu's side attempting to mess with Naofumi all throughout the race, trying to mess with his odds of winning. The villagers, they would praise Naofumi for his win against Motoyasu, and they would even award Naofumi with a carriage and a bill of passage before he left the village. They were just glad that no taxes were going to be raised. They were glad that Motoyasu was no longer going to be their lord, but rather the guy that actually protected them during the wave. The villagers were deciding to actually give to Naofumi with a carriage that Vilo would appreciate very much, and a bill of passage before he left. The next morning, though, Naofumi would notice something very strange. This being that Philo and Tiberius transformed into human-like beings. Philo, she had long blonde hair and crystal blue eyes with bright white wings just like him around her back. Tiberius, he would actually have white hair, green eyes, and he had brown wings as well. Naofumi would immediately cover these two up with his cape, and he would go on to search for a way to get the two some clothes that would not immediately just rip when they transformed into their animal forms. He had to defeat Nu along the way in order to get the magical crystal required for creating the magical thread, though. He would hand the gem over to the tailor, who would get to work on the outfits for his party members. By the end of the day, the tailor would have finished creating the new costumes or the new outfits for Philo and Tiberius. But she would decide to ask Naofumi a question, though. This being whether or not Naofumi was related to the two, pointing at Philo and Tiberius. Before Naofumi could even answer their question, though, Philo would practically answer for him, calling Naofumi Papa, and she would hug his leg. Naofumi, he would just be embarrassed, while the tailor, they would just be giggling at the reaction. And yeah, that's basically part 1. Well, part 1 of 2 for the movie. And yeah, I literally got nothing else to say. Yeah, like, that's basically all I have to say for right now. Time Clan, it's your boy King Time X, out. You guys already know the deal. If you like the video, hit that subscribe button. Well, especially if you've been rocking with my content for a little while now. If you just like this video, if this is your first video, maybe leave a comment and hit the like button. And maybe share the video to some friends who are also interested in this sort of content and you figure that they may like this video as well. But besides that, I literally have nothing else to say. Peace. And I'm actually trying to add more energy into like my voice though, by the way. If look, I'm trying here. But yeah, peace.